would you have any thoughts on the new U.S. ambassador to Israel? Because there was some controversy around his appointment. And secondly, how does this, if at all, affect Netanyahu's re-election prospects?
Well, the new ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, I think suffered from policy whiplash because he thought the embassy was going to be moved. He thought he was going to be have an office in Jerusalem. He spoke about all of this before the president was sworn into office. And now he's just arrived in Israel, and he's telling the Israelis, according to press reports, that they need to focus on making peace, and that he'll be operating out of the embassy in Tel Aviv. I think that he understands very well what every ambassador understands. There are a few ambassadors in the audience here, I know. So I think I can speak for all of you. Your ambassadors are sent abroad to represent their leaders, to represent the policy of their leaders. And they don't get to decide independently what they're going to do. And so ambassadors, I hope I won't offend anybody here, but ambassadors are implementers of policies. They're not policy. They're not makers of policy. And if he thought he was the maker of policy, I'm not sure he did. He understands now that he's the implementer of a policy that is different to the one that he thought he was going to be pursuing. Sorry.
And Bibi's re-election? On Netanyahu's re-election prospects.
Well, I think the election in Israel is not due for another, 2 years? But the closer you get to that 2-year mark, and certainly once you're in the last year before an election, the coalition starts to come apart as coalition members start to calculate how they're going to promote themselves, and therefore they want to distance themselves from the government in one way or another. That usually tends to be the case. So Israeli governments don't normally last out their 4-year terms. There are exceptions, but that tends to be the dynamic. In this case, there's another dynamic that's been introduced because the Prime Minister is under police investigation on a number of issues. He's been interrogated a number of times. His wife's been interrogated. His son's been interrogated. His friends are being interrogated. Sheldon Adelson is coming to Israel with the president. He's going to be interrogated with his wife. This is not very pleasant for anybody concerned. But it raises the spectre that the Prime Minister is going to be indicted sooner rather than later. I don't know whether that will happen. I have no idea whether it will happen. But there is an expectation in Israel, politically, that it's going to happen. And so that starts to create a dynamic where again, the parties start to calculate what they're going to do. There is a convention, it's not a requirement, but there's a convention that if the sitting Prime Minister is indicted, he should step down. That is certainly what happened in the case of Ehud Olmert. He actually stepped down even before he was indicted, but it was clear he was going to be indicted and he stepped down. So there's a precedent for that. And I think it's hard to say, but I think part of Prime Minister Netanyahu's calculation is maybe it's better, if I'm going to be indicted, maybe it's better to go for an early election, get the mandate of the people, and that will be a way to resist the idea that I should have to step down if I'm indicted. So that's the uncertainty there is whether there will be an early election. Certainly in Israel, the heads of the political parties are kind of calculating that it's going to come before the end of the year. My experience in Israel is always takes longer than you expect. So if it happens, it's likely to be next year. So that's a long way of getting to the point about what are his re-election prospects. There's no doubt that today, notwithstanding all of these difficulties, he remains the most credible of the candidates for prime minister. He stands in the polls 15 to 20% ahead of his closest rival, who is Yair Lapid, the head of the Centre Party. But it so much depends on circumstances, and his government could well come down as a result of the pressure that comes from Trump to be responsive to his requirements to make a deal, and in those circumstances, where you've got a president who is pressing the Israelis to be forthcoming in this, that changes the dynamic in terms of how Israelis will respond in that kind of environment. In recent elections, the left-wing parties and the centre-left parties ran away from the peace issue. It was a liability to be associated with peace. You were either unrealistic or wanted to sell out the country if you dared to talk about peace. It became a kind of dirty word. Oslo, especially, no one ever mentioned Oslo anymore. Even at Shimon Peres's funeral, no Israeli politician mentioned Oslo. He was the architect of Oslo. By the way, Donald Trump mentioned Oslo in his welcome to Abu Mazen. So that, if the President of the United States is pushing the peace process, then it gives the centre and left parties something to campaign on, which they've been afraid to campaign on up to now. And so that could also change the dynamics. So, in context of Prime Minister with an indictment hanging over his head, police investigations, President who's pushing him to do things that he can't do because of his coalition, it creates a very different environment that we've seen in recent past for him in terms of his re-election. I would never count him out. He's by far the smartest and most astute politician in Israel, but he's facing some really strong headwinds.
One more question before I open it up to people, just to bring it out of, put this in a regional context. You have a wider region that is in a great deal of upheaval. You have an Iran nuclear agreement, about which questions have now been raised. You have ISIS on the back foot in Syria and Iraq, although the civil war continues. Turkey, you have a stronger Erdogan, who has now just got a renewed mandate. You have a Saudi Arabia that's undergoing a great deal of internal reform, or change at least, and you have a Yemen civil war that seems to have been forgotten or is a footnote in all of this. Those are just some of the quite momentous changes that seem to be taking place in the region. How is the scene from Israel's point of view? Has that changed its national security calculus in any way? How is this churn in the region really affecting Israel?
I think the most important concern of Israel is one that's shared with the Sunni Arab countries and Sunni leaders that Trump is going to meet in Saudi Arabia before he goes into Israel. That concern is Iran. While the immediate threat of a nuclear Iran has been taken off the table for at least 10 years, in the region, the view of that deal, both Sunni leaders and Israeli leaders view that deal as having enabled Iran to press its various advantages across the region and really begin to establish this kind of arc of Iranian influence that stretches from Lebanon on the Mediterranean to Syria, a land bridge to Shia-dominated Iraq, then to Yemen, where the Iranians are supporting the Shia Houthis, and so there's this. I should have said the Iranians are via Hezbollah on Israel's northern border as well, and in Lebanon, and trying to establish a position in Syria on Israel's border on the Golan Heights. So the combination is one that's deeply threatening to Sunni Arab leaders like the Saudis, the Emiratis, to a lesser extent the Egyptians, but the other Gulf states as well, Jordan, and therefore there is a kind of common interest that is palpable that did not exist before, and the relationships between Israel and these countries is quietly developing in ways that the relationship between Israel and India developed quietly at first, but there's a much greater sense of imminent threat here that is fueling this. Now Trump is going to Saudi Arabia. He's going to meet with all the Arab leaders and some Muslim leaders as well. This is to kind of promote the coalition against ISIS and Islamic militancy. But it's also designed to try to get them to take a more forward-leaning position towards Israel so as to use that as leverage to promote the deal, the Israeli-Palestinian deal.
Thank you. So one of my takeaways from this conversation so far is that Trump may be the first president who is both impeached and wins the Nobel Peace Prize. But let's see. Let me open this up to people in the audience. So let's start here. Come on. Yeah. There's a microphone behind you, and if everyone could please introduce themselves as well.
Yes, Professor Anita Inder Singh. What exactly does Trump see India and Israel doing in West Asia? In fact, what did his predecessors, Bush and Obama, actually see India doing in West Asia with or without Israel? Because I presume that whatever Trump does will sort of follow on from there, one way or another. So it's not very clear to me why the U.S. has been so keen on this Israel-India relationship. With reference to West Asia, I can understand that they were in favor of it because they're two friendly countries. But what have they really seen India and Israel doing in West Asia?
Or perhaps another way of saying it, what would Washington, regardless of the dispensation of this government, what would the U.S. like to see India do more of in the region, perhaps? I mean,
something
would that
like
be,
that.
yeah, would that be more?
It's a biggish question, I know. It goes a bit round.
Yeah. So I think the U.S. attitude towards the Israel-India relationship has been a kind of bipartisan one. Obviously, George W. Bush really took the U.S.-India relationship to a higher strategic plane, but that was certainly endorsed by Obama, and so it was entirely consistent with the upward trajectory in U.S.-India relations. For Israel, close ally of the United States, fellow democracy, to do things with India that maybe it wasn't so easy or convenient for the United States to do. So I think that was the heart of it. I'm talking about the military relationship. I think that is an abiding reality. Now, in terms of Trump, it's very hard to say. Maybe you can say better than me, but it's not clear to me what his policy is towards India. It's not clear to me that it's on his radar screen yet. By the way, you should be thankful. Not because he's necessarily going to take a negative attitude, but just because it's completely unpredictable exactly what he's going to do. But I do think that the strategic realities will abide, and there are people around Trump who understand the value of India to the United States. that will I think prevail. Now, in terms of West Asia, you know, there's certainly a trend. Put Trump aside for a moment. There's a trend that developed during the Obama years, which was independent of Obama's desire to end the wars in the Middle East and pivot to Asia, which was the declining importance of Middle Eastern oil to the American economy. And that reduced dependence that was a product of fracking and the natural gas revolution in the United States meant that while the free flow of oil to our major trading partners like India and China, Japan and Europe was still a strategic interest of the United States, wasn't a vital interest of the United States in the sense that we would go to war again to protect that interest, especially in the context of our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think that's a long-term trend that's not going to reverse itself. And that means inevitably that India and China, who do have a more vital strategic interest in the oil and natural gas that's coming out of the Gulf, are naturally going to be looking to protect their interests more. And frankly, from the US point of view, great. We would like to share the burden, and indeed Trump's all about burden sharing. This isn't unanimous view in Washington, but there is a sense that, you know, China and India should do more when it comes to protecting that particular interest. Since up to now, I hope you won't be offended by this, but you've been free riding on the American Navy. The American taxpayers, excuse me, are getting tired overall of that notion that the United States should pay for other people's interests, other countries' interests. So that's the overall thing. Now, to the extent that Israel and the Gulf Arabs are now working together on the kind of strategic threat that they face in common, mainly coming from Iran, to the extent that India and Israel are growing closer for a whole lot of bilateral reasons, to the extent that India has some real concerns in the Gulf, there is a kind of, you can see the way in which there's a kind of community of interest that develops here. That is new and wasn't so evident before. There is, of course, and I'm sure you would all be the first to point out, there's a kicker in this because India doesn't have the same attitude towards Iran that Israel does, or that the Sunni Arabs do. And so it's not exactly an identical community of interest. But I think that there's enough there to suggest that there's a growing strategic concern, common concern in West Asia between Israel and India.
3 hands up, so if we can maybe take 3 questions together, so up here and then maybe the 3 of you back on the side.
Right. Ambassador, my name is Ishant Tiwari.
If you could just speak into the microphone, please.
I'm a freelancer and, write on West Asian issues. Now, I have 2 connected questions. This, Brookings, I am very grateful to Brookings to organize this talk, as this comes at a very crucial juncture. One, Trump is visiting Riyadh. On the other hand, the One Road, One Belt conference is going on in Beijing. Now, how do you see Trump as a whole, as a president? Because Trump, has he got a method to his madness, or he is just totally mad? Number one. Number two, you have seen OROB. So OROB, has it got any significance as far as India and the greater West Asia region is concerned? Is China trying to, encircle India in different ways? Thank you so much.
You could pass it back to.
Yeah, this is Anupam Khanna, and my question follows on the last part of your previous answer. Almost any sort of game theoretic or strategic analysis, focusing on India's interests, and I think actually global interests, actually ends up giving a pivotal role to Iran in the Middle East. And so my question is, how do you square that circle? A related one with that is, when some time ago I was involved in some of this analysis, the other invariant at that time was Turkey. But again, Turkey has become, its role in the overall constellation of various powers or geopolitics is somewhat more uncertain at present, it seems. Or maybe that's just, at least the optics are such. How real is that, and what are the implications of that for India?
And then right behind you.
Shreyas Deshmukh from Delhi Policy Group, sir. So recently, Ambassador Peter Galbraith said that Iraqi Kurds will declare referendum of independence in this year. And while US is also supporting Turkish and Syrian Kurds to fight against ISIS. So what do you think, how much Israel will be accommodative if the new Kurdish country will emerge in the near future? Thank you.
So there's quite a lot there. One Belt, One Road, and actually, perhaps largely also, I think Israel-China relations are rather poorly understood here in India. But perhaps if you could elaborate on that, on the role of Turkey and where that fits in, and Kurdistan as well.
So the Trump relationship with Xi Jinping is another one of these unexpected developments. After all, he started by putting the whole one China policy on the table with his phone call to the president of Taiwan, but he quickly took that off the table, and at the Xi Jinping meeting over chocolate cake, it was a very beautiful chocolate cake, they bonded. At least that's our president's version of it. And so now, essentially, this is a slight exaggeration, but essentially, in exchange for supposed Chinese pressure on North Korea to stop their ballistic missile program and then freeze their nuclear program, President Trump seems to be willing to do a special trade deal with China, no longer threaten it with naming it as a currency manipulator, which is probably a good thing because it was manipulating its currency, but it was manipulating its currency to actually keep it up, not lower it. And so that was to the benefit of the United States. I think the president finally came to understand that. But in terms of South China Sea, we no longer seem to be prepared to challenge China on that either. So China seems to have done very well in these circumstances, and you would understand this far better than we do in Washington, but the United States, particularly with the tearing up of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, the United States then essentially signaled to our allies in this part of the world that we were going to be more in bed with China than we were going to be standing up to it, and they have to make their calculations accordingly. So One Belt, One Road fits very much into that notion of China using its funds and its infrastructure capacity to build really strong physical connections across Asia. Now, where that will actually go, whether the projects will actually get built, whether they'll turn out to be of great benefit, or whether the countries involved will end up in debt to China and feeling rather bad about what happened, is all a big question mark. And so we should always take this with a grain of salt. But there's no doubt that China is able to take advantage of this America First approach, this challenge or basically abandonment of the role that the United States played leading the international order for the last 7 decades. China is now standing up and declaring that they're in favor of an international rules-based order, the kind of very thing that we said they needed to accept. They're now saying we should accept it. It's a bizarre kind of situation. So I think that China has gained significantly from this unpredictable and unclear and zigzagging approach that we're getting from Washington. And I think that answers your question about is it method or madness. The issue of how to square India's approach to West Asia with Israel's approach to West Asia is, I think, the right question to ask, and it's not clear. But bilateral relationships don't necessarily require complete identity of interests. India and Israel live in different neighborhoods, and therefore have different approaches. I would like to think that in the end, and I know this is going to sound kind of Pollyannish, but that in the end it'll be possible to integrate Iran into a regional security framework with the Arabs and Israel, in which India, United States, and China can play a kind of reinforcing role. But that's a long way off. And I think that certainly for Prime Minister Modi's visit to Israel, he's going to, I would guess, want to keep Iran off the table, because that is an issue where there's, I don't see how there would be a meeting of minds. And I think that the Israelis, don't see India playing an important role in dealing with the threat that they perceive coming from Iran. The Gulf Arabs are much more important in that context, and of course the United States. So I think that the way it's squared in the meantime is to just put it off the table. In terms of the Kurds, well, the Kurds are always announcing independence, but somehow they never do. And so I wouldn't get carried away with these declarations. They certainly have the aspiration to have an independent state, but they are very much aware of the political and geostrategic realities of the environment in which they live. And they do not want to jeopardize what they've got by creating an independent state that would be threatening or unacceptable to Iraq and Turkey. And so I just doubt that is likely to happen. In the meantime, though, the United States' commitment to Kurdistan, which began after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the U.S. eviction of him from there, is now has strong roots, and I think that's very helpful to Kurdish autonomy in Iraq. Now, the Syrian Kurds is a whole different story, but we need the Syrian Kurds to defeat ISIS. They're the only ones who are capable on the ground to do that job. The Turks really have a problem with that, because the Syrian Kurds are aligned with the PKK, which we regard as a terrorist organization, which the Kurds certainly regard as a terrorist organization. And so the Kurds won't accept that. So we've got a very complicated situation there. But our interest in combating ISIS is prevailing over Turkish opposition to arming the Syrian Kurds. It will limit how far we go with that, but we have decided to arm them, and I think that's the right thing to do. At the same time, we're stepping up our cooperation with Turkey against the PKK. And so that's an attempt to balance our interests there and avoid an all-out confrontation with the Turks over that issue. And so far it seems to be working.
I think we had 3 questions in the third row. I think the gentleman here. No, Matthew. We'll go start with you. And then.
Hi, Matthew Sada with the U.S. Embassy. And I have a question on the institution of the think tanks in Washington, D.C. right now, and their influence on policy, whether it's through ideas that are generated or whether it's through people that would serve in the administration. Just to take appointments, for example, like while every administration has had a range of individuals serving overseas in different ambassadorial positions, whether they had been contributors to campaigns, etc., in this administration, we may be seeing a different model emerge for an appointment. And I'm just curious if you would comment at all on what you think about, again, the role of the think tank in Washington, D.C. today, and then again, the how appointments, ambassadorial appointments, or other foreign policy officials may be different under this administration. We obviously just mentioned, one of them being President Trump's ambassador to Israel.
Could you hand it over to your right? Yeah, thank you, Arjun.
Ambassador, this is Arjun Hardas from the American Jewish Committee, AJC. Along with 25 years of Indo-Israeli relations, we've also got 25 years of Sino-Israel relations. Compared to the pace in the last 25 years of formal diplomatic ties between India and Israel, the ties and the relationships and the movement, especially between China and Israel, have been far stronger, far more visible, with more, let's say, high-level diplomatic visits with the prime ministers, presidents, multiple visits between each other. Is there a sort of in Asia especially, the Look East, Netanyahu's Look East policy, of Sino-Israel ties overshadowing and going far beyond what India and Israel would hope to do?
You want to take those two?
Well, think tanks are part of the establishment in Washington. They're part of the swamp that Trump has decided he's going to drain. So to the extent that he's influenced by the ideology of Steve Bannon, who wants to destroy the state and its institutions, think tanks kind of exist in that ecosystem, and so they're kind of part of it. Think tanks normally provide the policy advisors to the campaigns, and then they populate a lot of the senior policy positions in the new administration. In this case, most of the Republican policy experts, many of them residing in think tanks in Washington, came out against Trump during the primaries, signed letters saying they'd never work for Trump, criticized him quite vocally because of his positions that were isolationist and against the role of the United States in terms of leading the international order. And so as a result of the combination of those things, you have a White House that doesn't put a high priority on filling senior positions because they see the government as somehow part of the problem, not part of the solution. So on the one side, and on the other side, they have a hard time filling those positions that they would fill because there are so many people that don't pass the litmus test. Anybody who's criticized Trump or signed a letter against Trump or so on is eliminated. They can't be part of the team. I think that's that's kind of gone to a ridiculous point. I mean, probably few people in this room will remember it, but Henry Kissinger, when Ford lost the nomination to, not Ford, what am I talking about? Rockefeller lost the nomination to Nixon back in 1968, Henry Kissinger went around denouncing Nixon as the worst possible candidate, a complete disaster, etc., etc. And Nixon turned around and appointed him as his national security advisor. And when asked about all the things that Kissinger had said, he said, well, that's just politics. And that's the way that Trump should have handled it, but he's got a very thin skin. And so, therefore, he's kind of deprived himself of a large body of policy experts that could do the job for him and would be loyal to him, but he doesn't trust them. And since, as we've seen, loyalty is more important than a whole lot of other things, that's part of the problem. Now, excuse me. In terms of, you asked about Brookings, Brookings, ironically, even though we're a centrist institution, we actually don't take any positions politically as an institution. Scholars are free to do so, but the institution itself is non-partisan. But it tends to be identified or not identified with the Heritage Foundation or the American Enterprise Institute, which, you know, and other think tanks on the right. Brookings doesn't suffer from that whole dynamic that I just described. So one of our senior fellows is now advising Trump on Russia. She's in charge of Russia and Europe in the National Security Council. We have many different relationships with the Trump administration, with people who are non-ideological, like General Mattis or Secretary Tillerson or so on. And so it's, I say, ironic and somewhat surprising that we actually are able to engage in the way that we would normally do so, even though that's somewhat unexpected. In terms of Sino-Israel versus Sino-India, I know this is a normal way to look at things from Delhi's perspective. That is to say, the competition with China determines everything else. But in fact, I think it's the wrong lens to look at this through. I don't see any contradiction between Israel having a strong relationship with China and Israel having a strong relationship with India. And the two are operating on parallel tracks, and I'm not aware, maybe I don't know enough about it, but I'm not aware of any place in which India has said, we're not going to work with you on this because China is doing it, or vice versa. Both China and India have an interest in high-tech cooperation with Israel, in military cooperation, even though that has potential to be problematic. And so I think that the bilateral relationships are growing despite the fact of a certain rivalry between China and India.
There's a question up here in the front. There'll just be a microphone coming to you.
Ambassador, I'm Marshall Rai, retired 2 years ago, and served in Israel as the defense attaché, 2003 to 6. You were not there then. But while I was there, I learned of a situation when some of the unmanned vehicles which Israel had sold to China had come for an upgrade, and there were instructions from Washington not to send them back. Not to sell them. Not to send them back after the upgrade, reflecting the fact that Washington does control Israel vis-a-vis its defense equipment or defense side of the relationship with other countries. But now, Israeli companies are setting up manufacturing plants in China. And it's our worry that if that were to happen and the defense equipment with Israeli, probably American technology to go in there, it'll be with them and it could pass on to Pakistan. So what is your view on that aspect? And do you, or does Washington have a view on this, and do they control this?
So, Washington's concern about the Israeli military relationship with China is all about enhancing China's capacity vis-a-vis the United States. And that's where the United States has intervened and on several occasions and blocked the transfer of weapon systems or early warning systems, radar systems or so on to China, because it had American technology in those systems, and they would have, in the view of the United States, presented an enhanced ability of China to deal with the United States militarily. And that was the justification for blocking it. The United States does have the ability to block sales which have American technology in them. That's all. In the technology transfers to Israel, that's always the case. There is that veto power. And so that will continue. It's not that the US controls Israel, it's that the US controls its own technology in those circumstances. As far as I know, that has not been a problem between Israel and India vis-a-vis the United States. As far as I'm aware, I'm not fully aware of it. But it is a problem in the case of China, and that's because we do not identify India as a potential threat to the United States or our interests, and we do see China as a potential rival and threat in that regard. So, that does not involve India's rivalry with Pakistan. That's not part of the calculation. And so your concern about that, which I can understand, is something that, if it's a real concern, Prime Minister Modi needs to raise with the Prime Minister of Israel, because that's one direction. He could also raise it with, if it is indeed American technology that's involved, he could also raise it with President Trump. But it's not part of the natural calculation that the United States makes or that Israel makes. It's your conflict, it's not ours, and it's not Israel's.
Robert?
Paul Chaudhary, Hindustan Times. Most predictions now expect the Islamic State as a territorial entity to end sometime in the next 1 year or 8 months or so on. Once that happens, how would that change, in your view, the should we say, geopolitical calculations of the key countries in that region and the United States, whether it's Iran, Saudi Arabia, or Israel?
Yeah, interesting question. The first question is, where does ISIS go? Because they've had plenty of time to shift. They can see this coming. They understand what the end game is, as you describe it, and so they're obviously were trying to put a foothold in Libya. I think that's been at least contained, and it'll be possible to eliminate it there. Boko Haram is another one. The Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Those maybe in the operating in the desert areas of Syria. But there's still, ISIS is not going to disappear completely. And of course, there's the problem of ISIS cells that have managed to infiltrate back into Europe, the United States, potentially countries here. I don't think India has that problem, but China could have that problem. And certainly Russia could face that problem. So that's one challenge, is the morphing or metastasizing of ISIS back into a more Al-Qaeda type operation rather than having a state with territory to defend. The second challenge is the post-conflict reconstruction of those areas that used to be controlled by ISIS. And the question there is who will be in control and whether it will be possible to ensure that there's rehabilitation, resettlement, repatriation of displaced persons and so on. There's a lot of work to be done there. In the case of Libya, we walked away from it. We cannot afford to walk away from it this time because we'll have a kind of Al-Qaeda 3.0. If ISIS was Al-Qaeda 2.0, we'll have a 3.0 come back there. And part and parcel of that is the importance of managing the ethnic tensions, in particular the religious tensions, I should say, not ethnic. In particular, these are Sunni areas they've controlled. Sunnis need to be in control after ISIS is eliminated. If the Shias move in, Shia militias, Iranian-controlled, somehow manage to get control in those areas, then it's going to create more tension and recreate the circumstances in Iraq that led to the rise of ISIS. So that becomes very important. I think it's more possible to do now because Prime Minister Abadi is very different from Prime Minister Maliki was. He's not a Shia chauvinist. He understands that he has to have a big tent approach. The Sunnis have to have their role, as do the Kurds in a reconstructed Iraq. But the Iranians have a big opportunity in this to use their Shia militias that they have in both Syria and Iraq to try to consolidate this land bridge that I was describing between Iran, Iraq, northern Iraq, and eastern Syria. And so that is a big challenge as well. They have a high interest in trying to take advantage of the situation post-ISIS, and I think the Sunni states, the United States and Israel have a big interest in trying to prevent that from happening, trying to prevent ISIS from coming south to the border with Jordan, and trying to prevent Hezbollah from coming south to the border with the Golan, with Israel. So, overall, I think there's a big challenge out there, but one in which the American partners in the region, including Iraq, need to play a very important role. We can concert it, we can support it, but they need to be the ones to take the lead.
We'll do a last round of questions. I have Suman Berry in the front. If there's anybody else who'd like to pitch in, then Marcus in the back.
Yes, Suman Berry, independent. I thought it would have come up before now, but since it hasn't, let me ask you. You've been very clear about how India should read the signals vis-a-vis China coming out of the White House. So for this troubled region, what is the current state of play on U.S.-Russian relations? How does that impact on this whole web of conflict?
Yes, well, it's hard to say, Suman, because the U.S.-Russian relationship is fraught now. It's burdened by Russian interference in our elections, by the Russian connection to the Trump campaign, which has a kind of big question mark over what exactly that was about, by the suspicion in the United States that Trump has something going on with Russia. And this latest episode where Lavrov is invited into the Oval Office and then Trump brags about or tells him, spills the beans about some highly sensitive intelligence issue, has just kind of compounded this sense that the Russian relationship is just fraught. And that reality kind of bumps up against the clear desire of Trump to work with Russia, at least in Syria, against ISIS. He has in his head that Russia holds the key to the defeat of ISIS. I don't know where this comes from. It probably came from General Flynn, but I think it's misplaced. The Russians never were in Syria to fight ISIS. If they fought ISIS, it was, an adjunct to their real purpose, which was to ensure the survival of the Assad regime. There have been notions out there, and I don't know whether President Trump subscribes to this, but it's certainly his advisors have spoken to it, which is that an alliance with Russia in Syria could lead to Russia pushing Iran out of Syria and thereby breaking that arc of influence that I was describing. And some of his advisors have gone so far as to suggest that the United States should drop the sanctions on Russia over the Ukraine as a carrot to get their cooperation in Syria. I know this probably sounds far-fetched, but that's where we've been living for the last 3 months. Now, that hasn't been operationalized because for the reason that I described, of the way in which the relationship has become toxic. But the idea is still out there. And Trump from time to time talks about Russia working with him against ISIS. That is as far as I can see their thinking goes. It's about Russia's role in the Middle East as a partner rather than a competitor. It doesn't seem to spread to this part of the world, and calculations about relations with Russia vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis India. So I really don't think that policy towards India has been formulated, and so it's not the idea that Russia, where will Russia fit into this and how will that impact on it. I just think it's really premature. I just don't they don't have the people in there to develop the policies yet. They don't have the bandwidth to deal with it yet, and I think you should be happy about that.
Last question, Marcus, in the back.
Hi, I'm Marcus from the Swedish Embassy. My original question was also on Russia, but since I have the microphone, I might as well ask if you could help characterize Israel's and the Palestinian view of Modi's policy towards them. How do they view, how does it matter? How big is the worry on the Palestinian Authority side? And what do they make of the shift in Indian policy towards them?
I'm not sure that I'm in a good position to comment on the Palestinian perspective. I think that it's part of a larger picture, which is that as Israel's relationships with countries beyond its region have grown, the commitment of those countries to the Palestinian cause has declined. And this is part of an overall phenomenon that the Palestinians have suffered from, which I think stems from another dynamic, which is that as the Arab states have become far more preoccupied with their own problems, their focus on the Palestinian problem has declined dramatically. And so if they're not focused on it, then why should countries beyond the Middle East focus on it? Now, I know that Europe has a different dynamic there, a different concern, but certainly that has, I think, made it easier for countries like India to lower the importance of the Palestinians in their calculations about how to engage with the region. That's very alarming for the Palestinians. The broader phenomenon of the way in which their cause has lost a lot of altitude, fairly dramatically, in the last decade, with the Arab revolutions and the rise of ISIS and all those other things that we've talked about in the region. And of course that's come at the same time as their own polity has been divided between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. So they've been going through a very hard time. I think their expectations have been lowered, but they've always looked to India as one of the primary supporters of their cause, their national cause. And so I don't think they can be happy about the way in which the balance has shifted towards Israel fairly dramatically under Prime Minister Modi. But they just got a big present from President Bush. He embraced them in a way that they haven't been embraced by anybody else for a very long time. I mean, Abu Mazen was facing an effort by Egypt, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates and Jordan to displace him in favor of a different leadership. His relations with his traditional Arab backers are quite fraught. So for him to be embraced by the President of the United States is a huge boost. It's a huge boost to him domestically amongst the Palestinians, and it's a boost to him internationally. Suddenly he's back in the game. And so I think that, again, you become a kind of, India becomes a kind of beneficiary of this. You should be thankful to President Trump because the Palestinians are going to be less upset about India's burgeoning relationship with Israel if they've got the United States embracing them in this way.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming. This was a very lucid overview that you gave, particularly given that you arrived at 3 a.m. last night. So very grateful for all of that. I would like to thank all of you for coming again. We have some refreshments outside, so please stay and have a cup of coffee and join us for that. One final announcement: we have an event next week. There's it's detailed on the piece of paper on your seats, which is on 3 years of Modi's foreign policy. That'll be in this room on May 24th. So I look forward to seeing some of you there. Thank you very much.